Ukraine is a very difficult slog, and the Ukrainians have suffered significant casualties in their initial attempts to penetrate.
Also tonight, supporters of Sikh separatism take to the streets in Toronto and Vancouver. And why some French-speaking students say they're being denied a university education in their own language.
You shouldn't have to move to Toronto to get a high-quality post-secondary education.
That's later, but first. It is 500 days since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In a statement, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau joined other NATO leaders in showing continued solidarity with Kyiv. Today, Ukraine's military released a video allegedly showing its soldiers attacking Russian positions near Bakhmut. But the much-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive has been slower than hoped. And as the two sides mark this grim milestone, they appear to be more entrenched than ever. Katie Nicholson has more.
In this video, to mark the 500th day of the war, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy rides the choppy waters against a pink sky to Snake Island, the windswept rock in the Black Sea, which became a symbol to Ukrainians when its border guards famously told an invading Russian warship to go F itself. It's proof Ukraine will regain every part of its territory, he says. Russia released its own video of Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu meeting with troops on a training exercise. Thousands have died following the Russian invasion, including nearly 10,000 Ukrainian civilians. Entire cities have been leveled. As the war grinds on, Ukraine's need for more weapons, creating more tensions. On Friday, the U.S. announced it would supply Ukraine with cluster munitions, weapons which release multiple bomblets, which have historically had devastating consequences for civilians. They're banned by more than 100 countries, including Canada. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy championed Canada's international efforts to ban landmines and cluster munitions 20 years ago.
I think this is a statement by the United States which could be very divisive in terms of the NATO alliance, in terms of countries that come together because we believe in the values that we're fighting for, which are humane and protect civilians. And the use of cluster munitions are a total and complete antithesis to that.
Andrew Assoulis is a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a retired Department of National Defense official.
This doesn't augur well, this political decision on munitions or cluster munitions to Ukraine at the time when they're looking at trying to get into NATO, where the majority of NATO countries are opposed to these weapons.
Global Affairs Canada issued a statement saying it doesn't support the use of cluster munitions, and today, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak voiced his stance.
The UK is signatory to a convention which prohibits the production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use,
setting the stage for what could be a politically fraught NATO summit next week. Katie Nicholson, CBC News, Toronto.
Hundreds of Sikh activists are rallying in Canadian cities, calling for an independent Sikh homeland separate from India. Today's protests come just weeks after the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a prominent supporter of the Khalistan movement. Idil Musa reports.
This protest just outside of Toronto is one of many happening in cities around the world Saturday in memory of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. The Sikh community leader was shot to death last month outside a temple in Surrey, BC. Nijjar was a vocal supporter of Khalistan, an independent Sikh state in the Punjab region, and demonstrator Kuljit Singh believes that played a role in his death.
We're here to make it clear to the Indian government, along with all its diplomats and representatives, that we understand that they had a hand in the brutal assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
There is no evidence India had a hand in Nijjar's death, and police in Canada say they have not found a link to the country in their investigation. Still, protesters here are traveling to the Consulate General of India in Toronto to protest his death.
He represented hope. He was a shining light. He stood up as a loud voice, as a beacon of courage when no one else was prepared to talk about Punjab's freedom.
Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly expressed concern about the safety of India's top diplomats in Canada after their photos appeared on demonstration posters labeling them as Najjar's killers. CBC News reached out to the Indian High Commission in Ottawa for comment on the protests and the posters, but received no response. Sikhs for Justice, which organized Saturday's event and is behind an unofficial global referendum on Sikh separatism, claims the organization's actions are not about inciting violence.
India is not a person. India is a system.
Gurpatwat Singh Panam is with Sikhs for Justice.
What we mean by kill India is that we are going to kill the Indian system that is responsible for the genocidal violence against the Sikh community.
Canadian journalist Gurpreet Singh says while the movement for a Sikh homeland has no meaningful support in Punjab state today, he sees a direct correlation between the growth of Hindu nationalism in Indian politics and the surge of the Khalistan movement abroad.
This is a spillover effect of what is happening in India. We should not forget that Air India disaster was also a spillover effect of what was happening in India back in 80s.
It's one of the worst air disasters ever.
In 1985, a bomb exploded on an Air India flight en route from Toronto to London, England, killing more than 300 people.
The flight may have been Air India's. It may have taken place off the coast of Ireland, but in so many ways, this is a Canadian tragedy.
The attack was planned by a group of Sikh extremists in BC. It happened after the Indian Army stormed the Golden Temple, the holiest site in the Sikh religion.
If India has chosen to become a Hindu state, then it has to give some space to other minority groups to decide their future.
Gurpreet Singh says Canada has a role to play in holding India accountable for the treatment of minorities and helping to protect them from persecution. Idil Musa, CBC News, Toronto.
For more on the Sikh separatist movement in Canada, I spoke earlier to Satwinder Bains. She's a professor at the University of the Fraser Valley in Abbotsford, BC. Professor Bains, the Sikh separatist movement isn't new. It's been around for decades. But it seems like there's been a resurgence in recent years. Why do you think that is?
Partly it's actions that happen on foreign soil or on Indian soil that reactivate the kind of feelings that people have about Khalistan. I wouldn't say it's ever really gone away. It has always been around, whether it's in certain circles or doesn't make the public media is another thing. But I think there is this presence of Khalistan in Canada that can't be denied and that is always simmering and is always needing to be questioned, addressed, understood, however you want to address that, because I think partly the reason that it raises its head again and again is that there is no resolution to Khalistan, right? Like this is a movement mostly from abroad, looking for a place, ethno-cultural, ethno-religious site or state within India.
And I'm wondering, because we were looking at these protests that were scheduled in places all over the world, like London and Melbourne, and also in Canada. The ones overseas, like in London and Melbourne, they were quite small, under 50 people is my understanding, whereas the one in Canada seems to be about 300 or 400. So still not a massive protest, but quite a bit larger. Why do you think that is? Why Canada?
Canada has always traditionally been a very safe place since early migrants came in 1900. Canada has always allowed people a place to protest, to say they have their voice. Although after 1947, independence of India, and after the Second World War, Canada became more of a liberal economy, and multiculturalism provided the safe space for people to feel that they can maintain their cultural ties, their heritage, their politics to countries like India and other countries around the world. So Canada has been a very conducive place for people to air their political views. And I wouldn't say it's good or bad. I would say it has its values, both on one side where people feel strong enough about something that they can protest in peacefully and make international news and let people know what's going on. But at the same time, it allows people also the opportunity to feel invested in their cultural roots.
Well, how connected do you think the movement is in Canada or in other countries to what's happening in India itself?
I think it's very connected to what's happening in India, but the Khalistan movement itself has a stronger voice abroad, because don't forget, this is 2% of India's population, and it doesn't get the kind of short shrift that it should perhaps get in India if Khalistan were to raise its flag, and it does regularly do that in India as well. Canada allows us to question the reasons for Khalistan. It allows us to ask whether Khalistan should happen and how it can happen, and perhaps these ideas of referendums across other parts of the globe as well as in Canada. And I think we keep coming back to the same question, that if there was resolution to Khalistan, perhaps it would have some rest, and perhaps there would come a day when it was yes or no. Referendums in Canada don't mean anything. They have no political clout. The referendum has to happen in India. The province of Punjab has to have a referendum whether they want Khalistan or not. This is a foreign kind of idea playing out in Canada as well as other parts of the world with roots in India, but it is still very much more voiced in Canada.
And do you think people in the Sikh communities in Canada who are born and raised here feel as strongly about this as maybe their parents or the people who actually immigrated here do?
That's a kind of a complicated question in the sense that kids who are born here, and we have the largest second generation of South Asian and Punjabi kids born in Canada now, those children may have never been to the homeland, their parents' homeland, but those families that are invested in Khalistan, yes, there is a new generation of children born in Canada who are also as invested in these issues. So I would say it's not an either or. I think there are kids who are born in Canada who are still invested, and kids who are coming from India who are still invested, and parents, both parents who have maybe even been born here as well.
Professor Bains, thank you so much for your insights on this.
Thank you for having me.
Satwinder Bains is a professor at the University of the Fraser Valley in Abbotsford, BC. Franco-Ontarians in Sudbury say they are dismayed by a recent decision by the provincial government to not fund a French-language university in the city. Sudbury's French-speaking community had been pursuing the idea for years. Casey Stranges has more.
You shouldn't have to move to Toronto to get a high-quality post-secondary education.
Serge Maville says it's not fair to force francophones to leave their hometowns to go to school. That's why the University of Sudbury president was pushing to open a standalone French university in his city. About 40,000 people, or a quarter of Sudbury's population, identifies as francophone, making it Ontario's second largest French-speaking community after Ottawa.
So the plan at the U of S was notably to give access to that high-performing programming locally.
So when the news came right before Canada Day that the province rejected the school's proposal, it came as a shock. Ontario's Ministry of Colleges and Universities says a lack of demand for French programs was a major factor in its decision. Maville says after 2 years of working with Doug Ford's government, this was a sudden shift.
They commented favorably on the quality of this business plan. The business plan, by the way, really does indicate there is a need for a French language university in the region.
The idea for a French language university arose after Laurentian University filed for bankruptcy protection in 2021, and it severed ties with the University of Sudbury.
And all of a sudden, there's this dramatic turn. There's something not okay with that process.
Denis Constantineau questions how the Ontario government reached its decision. He's the spokesperson for a coalition of francophone organizations. He says he fears the province's decision will lead to brain drain in Northern Ontario.
We're pushing people away from our community.
Marie-Pierre Héroux is a former U of S student and an advocate for French education in the province. She's convinced the province is missing some important data.
If you look at the university, the French University in Toronto, they have students. So there are students that do want to continue their studies in French.
In a statement to CBC News, a ministry spokesperson says francophone students still have options in Sudbury, the bilingual Laurentian University, and Collège Boreal. Casey Stranges, CBC News, Sudbury.
No matter where you are in the world, there was one story on everybody's mind this week: the heat. According to data from the University of Maine, this was the hottest week ever recorded, with daily average temperature records broken on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. People cool off at a Barcelona beach this week. Spain experienced its hottest spring ever this year, and Spanish forecasters say this coming Tuesday, the mercury could reach a record high of 43.4 degrees, while Germany's weather agency is warning that country could see a high of 37 degrees tomorrow.
So all the numbers are suggesting that we're going in the wrong direction when it comes to the heat.
Claire Nasir is with the UK's Meteorological Office. That agency said last month was the hottest June ever recorded in Britain and has issued a weather health alert for this weekend, warning of dangerously high temperatures in 6 UK regions. We're concerned about getting a tan, says this Beijing woman. That city was so hot, it ordered all outdoor work to stop on Thursday. It was the second heat-related red alert for the city in 2 weeks. A splash pad provides some relief for children and adults in Phoenix, Arizona. The Southwest United States has already gone through scorching heat, and it will get worse. The U.S. National Weather Service says that region is about to endure one of the longest and most intense heat waves it has ever experienced. This woman says the heat makes her daily tasks unbearable.
It is hot and it's very draining. It's very, very draining. It is like oven when you walk out.
There is also a heat wave in Canada's north, with heat warnings across much of Yukon and the Northwest Territories. Gabe Hardesty says he has never felt temperatures above 30 degrees in Wrigley, Northwest Territories before, and that makes him anxious about the future.
The next 50, 60 years, everything's not going to be the same.
The World Meteorological Organization says the sweltering heat around the globe is from human-caused climate change and El Niño. That climate pattern drives up temperatures while also causing drought in some areas and heavy rains in others. The last time El Niño appeared was 2016, the hottest year ever recorded. The WMO says that'll likely change.
Basically, with El Niño, we have a high probability for this temperature to be one of the warmest on record.
The question for many people now is, who should be blamed for climate change, and how can they be held accountable? In Montana, a first-of-its-kind climate lawsuit wrapped up last month. The outcome is still not known, but legal experts say more climate litigation is likely on the way in the U.S. and in Canada. Ben Shingler now with that story.
Supporters of 16 young people cheer as they enter a Montana courthouse. They are at the center of a landmark case over the fight to address climate change. They are suing the state for failing to take action to curb global warming, just as their lawyer argued in court.
The state argues that climate change is a global problem. Plaintiffs localize this harm in their backyards of felled, diseased trees, the melting of Montana's majestic glaciers.
While those young people wait for a ruling, experts say climate litigation against both the government and corporations will become more common in the U.S. and in Canada.
There are climate cases around the world.
Natalie Chalafour is a law professor at the University of Ottawa who tracks and sometimes intervenes in climate litigation.
Canadian courts can look to see what other courts are deciding and how they're deciding that. And that can be really helpful because the issues presented by climate lawsuits are really novel.
There have already been 35 climate-related legal challenges in Canada. One of the most watched cases was brought forward in Ontario and has yet to be settled.
Because it's our right to use our voice in court.
Shaylin Wabagijik is at the heart of that fight. She's an Anishinaabe activist who is Caribou Clan from Temiskaming First Nation. Along with 6 others, she argued that the Ontario government's climate plan fails to protect them and future generations.
They need to make their decisions based on that climate science, and that's what we hope that our case will do.
The Ontario government argued in court that fighting climate change is a global responsibility and that its contribution to worldwide emissions is minuscule. The case was dismissed from Ontario Superior Court in April. The lawyer for the plaintiffs, Daniel Gallant, doesn't consider the decision a total loss, in part because the judge concluded the case could be decided in court.
Every other climate case in Canada has so far failed to clear that hurdle because courts have found the issues to be too political.
The plaintiffs are appealing the ruling and are expecting to make their case before the Ontario Court of Appeal early next year. Other cases in Canada are also before the courts, including a challenge in Saskatchewan against the province's power company.
What do we want? Climate justice!
And while people continue to shout in the streets for action on climate change, others are using the courts to make their voices heard. Benjamin Shingler, CBC News, Montreal.
Pakistani journalists say it's becoming increasingly difficult to do their jobs. The targeted killing of a prominent investigative journalist and the abduction of another has put a spotlight on the freedom of the press in Pakistan. Freelance reporter Abdul Sattar has more from Islamabad.
What they want to do is to intimidate me and all others who are abroad, who are speaking out against the blatant interference and pressure tactics of the regime.
Shaheen Sehbai is a well-known veteran Pakistani journalist currently living in the US.
I know of at least 3 cases registered against me for sedition and inciting violence against the armed forces. This is all nonsense and rubbish.
Sehbai is one of many prominent Pakistani journalists facing harassment and arrest by their government. And while the targeting of journalists is not new, the media is facing heightened pressure since former Prime Minister Imran Khan was removed from office.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम, अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, आप YouTube चैनल देख रहे हैं, मैं इमरान खान।
2 months ago, Imran Riaz Khan, a journalist critical of the current government, was arrested at an airport. His brother told Al Jazeera News he was trying to leave the country and has not been heard from since. According to a Lahore-based journalist, Habib Akram, it is now nearly impossible for any journalist to provide fair and balanced coverage of Pakistani politics.
Even if a journalist draws comparison between the two competing narratives of different events or on different situations, even it's not allowed. And if somebody does, he may face sedition charges, he may be abducted, as Imran Riaz Khan has been, or he may be expelled or fired from the job. Therefore, right now, Pakistan is not a good place for a journalist to work.
My name is Javeria Siddiq and I'm a working journalist associated with TRT Urdu Service.
Javeria Siddiq's husband, Arshad Sharif, was also a journalist. He was shot dead in Kenya last October.
He left the country because he was booked in a number of cases and it was just related to his investigative work because he was very fearless, he was very vocal, so he was booked in a sedition and treason charges all over the Pakistan.
The Pakistani government has opened an investigation into Sharif's murder, but Siddiq says she is still waiting for her husband's killers to be brought to justice. And she says the current political climate in Pakistan makes it difficult to even say his name on the air.
If we talk about censorship in Pakistan, so you can't say the name of Arshad Sharif and Imran Riaz on TV and on mainstream media, and that same goes for Imran Khan as well. So journalist community is anxious and afraid and doing self-censorship and not covering the story which will offend the powerful people in Pakistan.
Abdul Sattar for CBC News, Islamabad.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. Starting Mondays, you can download a special curated edition of the program featuring our favorite stories from the weekend. A near-empty Italian village has found a colorful way to attract new inhabitants. It's not using cheap real estate or tax incentives to lure people in. It's using street art to breathe new life into its centuries-old architecture. Megan Williams traveled to the sparsely populated region of Molise and brings us this report.
From every piazza, balcony, and window, you look out of Incivita Campomarano, lush green hills spread out in all directions. This crumbling medieval town is in the heart of Molise, a southern region with so few inhabitants. Italians jokingly call it No-lise.
In realtà Civita la gente ha iniziato ad andare via negli anni '80.
The population here dropped in the 80s when people left for jobs on the coast, says Elena Carelli, one of the 300 residents left, down from 3,000 at its peak. For years, Carelli struggled to attract people to the annual village fair. Then, 7 years ago, she caught a TV feature on a street artist in Rome whose designs of women emit a spirit of playful or defiant independence. The art spoke to her, and on a whim, she sent the artist an email.
So I was in New York, actually, when I received an email.
Says world-renowned muralist Alice Pasquini of the email that read,
But I have a dream. I know you will never answer. I saw you on TV, and I would love you to paint a wall here.
But Pasquini did respond. Pasquini wrote Carelli back. And not only did she paint a wall, but she helped launch a street art festival.
I mean, how you do a festival in a place with no restaurant, no B&B, no nothing, but we have people.
Artist friends who camped out in the abandoned homes as they painted the village walls. Now the town is an open-air museum where around every corner there's a startling work of art. Top global artists now come here to paint, like the Pakistani-German Hera of Hurkat, who's covered a towering stone wall with a wild cat girl, an homage to the cat eyes that greeted her when she first arrived here at night.
There was this line of cats on the street, and that was the first sign of life. So I thought, oh, okay, so they rule this place.
Thousands of visitors come here each year, and some 30 foreigners have bought houses here too. That cost as little as a few $1,000s.
I feel very inspired.
Says American therapist Jody Olstead, who works remotely from a small stone house that overlooks a valley. She says it was the art that convinced her to buy in Civita.
It really puts Civita on a map where it's been absolutely invisible.
It was like, okay, this is a great, lovely village. It's got all the right things.
Says Canadian Cal Weber, who now calls the village home.
But then I wanted that extra little detail of just, could this be something really interesting and stimulating culturally? That says a lot about the locals, too. Are they open to this kind of thing? And then I just went, okay, well, what's the weather like? What's,
Megan Williams, CBC News, Civita Campomarano.
You got a fast car. Is it fast enough so we can fly away? You gotta make a decision. Leave tonight or live and die this way.
A familiar tune there, Tracy Chapman's Fast Car. Off her 1988 debut, the song was a smash. It won a Grammy, Rolling Stone declared it the 71st greatest song of all time. It hit number 6 on the U.S. Billboard chart. 35 years later, it's number 1.
Had a feeling that I belong. Had a feeling I could be someone.
Kind of. This is the Luke Combs version, a pretty faithful cover, but with a country twang. It's number 1 on Billboard's country music chart, and while that's great for Combs,
Still ain't got a job, so I work in the market as a checkout girl.
It's history-making for Chapman. She is now the first black woman to be the sole songwriter of a country number 1. Celebrating black artists in country music has been slow going. There are some mainstays, beginning with Charlie Pride, who is known as the first black country superstar.
You've got to kiss an angel good morning and let her know you think about her when you're gone.
But there have only been 4 black women to have songwriter credits on country chart toppers, and they're all shared credits. And even up to a few years ago, who can forget when Lil Nas X's Old Town Road remix was removed from Billboard's country chart altogether?
I got the horses in the bag, horse stock is attached. Head is matted black, got the bushes black to match.
Tracy Chapman is known to be pretty reclusive, but she did release a statement to Billboard saying she never expected to find herself on the country charts, but is honored to be there, that she's happy for Luke and grateful that new fans have found and embraced Fast Car. So here's a little more of Tracy Chapman's original on The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Good night.
So I remember when we were driving in your car, speed so fast it felt like I was drunk. City lights lay out before us, and your arm felt nice wrapped around my shoulder.